Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we speak with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, we are joined by Mark Downie, who is a musician, blogger, and is currently a program manager on the Visual Studio team at Microsoft. Mark joins us today from Ohio in the United States. Mark Downie, we're so glad to have you on Maintainable.
Thanks very much for having me.
So, given your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, maintainable software code?
Matt, so for me, I think the one thing that kind of stands out is always the consistency of the code. It doesn't even matter so much for me whether it's consistently bad or consistently good. I just like consistency in the code. And, whatever design decision you have made, to be kind of true to it and to hope that stands out, because then at least whenever you think about maintaining it, you can think about the patterns that go into that code and look at it from a holistic standpoint very, very easily. So one of the things I always kind of encourage in code that I'm associated with it that is to make sure it's just at least consistent, and then we can have deeper philosophical discussions about whether that consistency is good or bad. But it certainly allows us to make the kind of changes wholesale if you need to, as long as you know what's there in the first place.
Have you found yourself, you talk about consistency, good or bad, and you mentioned like design decisions. Does that also reflect when you're using frameworks or not? Do you find that when there are frameworks being used with the applications you might have encountered over your career? I'm also maybe making an assumption you might have worked on projects that didn't necessarily have a clear framework to work in, but has that been, do you believe frameworks are helpful in that capacity, or is it kind of similar challenges regardless?
Yeah, no, I think frameworks kind of let you draw kind of like a rough map of the kinds of consistency I'm talking about, right? So you kind of lend from the framework you're on, and you kind of use it to kind of make decisions that kind of send you in the right direction, or maybe even the wrong direction, depending on what you've selected. So the framework informs the architecture and the decisions, and that kind of permeates the kind of design you want to create, and that kind of that kind of influences decisions you make going forward. So I think that the framework decision is the first big decision you make, and that informs the kinds of consistency you're going to create. So it's really important from my perspective that you really love the framework you've chosen in the first place. Because if your natural inclination is a design that works counter to your framework, then you kind of find yourself constantly fighting a battle, even if you don't necessarily recognize it at the surface. You kind of find yourself fighting in battle, and that kind of leads to what I think of as inconsistencies in code, where one style clashes with another or kind of works contrary to the other. So yeah, I think that framework decision is really important in making sure it sits well with your ideas and your design patterns.
I would imagine that a lot of people listening might not always get to be part of that initial conversation or decision too. So when they're joining a project, they're like, well, who decided we were going to use framework X versus Y, or why do we even use this framework? Or maybe this framework hasn't been significantly worked on in a couple of years and now it's outdated. And those developers are struggling to understand not only the framework, but just try to how to introduce their own approach and pattern into that kind of mix and can deviate or not.
Yeah, to be sure. I think as I've been helping maintain a project for a little while now, and I must admit, so we had to make a decision about this particular project. It was DOSblog. It's one of the oldest .NET open source projects out there. I think it started around in 2003. So it's like right at the inception of the .NET movement, right, and framework. And so it was heavily dependent on web forms. And at the start of my career, I was an expert at web forms. But we turned, for a variety of really good reasons, we no longer kind of, that's not the premier way which do it. Most people who are .NET and do web are probably doing some kind of MVC type architecture, using some kind of MCC type. So web forms just didn't sit very well in that idea. And so we had to make a decision about, should we, this really old project, is it worth continuing with web forms? how many people are we going to get to be able to contribute to a web forms project at this point in 2020? And so that actually was a really important decision to say, I just don't think that it's worth. There's lots of parts of this project that are absolutely worth maintaining, that should never die, because they work and they work very, very well. But that particular part of the project, we really have to rethink that, because first of all, there's not a lot of people who know it at this point. And there's not a lot of people who know it and would be willing to help. So what we have to decide here is what parts of this project are worth maintaining and what parts do we genuinely have to let go. And I think that's a reasonable question to ask yourself. I like software. I like the promises we make with software. I like maintaining those promises and I like keeping them. But at some point, it just becomes impractical to maintain certain promises of the software. So we had to make a decision right then, because that was so pivotal to the software, that we had to say, we're going to have to abandon this particular part of the project and adopt something else in order for us to continue it and frankly to even get the help we needed to continue.
I'm curious, like with that type of scenario, are there conversations about like, all right, is this a permanent change you're going to make, or is there a plan to reevaluate what you decide on so that you don't find yourself 15 plus years later going, wow, the decision we made back in 2020, that's no longer relevant? Like, are there conversations about what's appropriate for the near term versus long term, or is it more of how do we build something and integrate something that we know that we're going to potentially need to come back and refactor or replace at the unknown future, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that goes back to one of your first questions about the framework, right? So first, I think the selection of whatever framework or architecture or design we're going to build on, is there a great runway for that, right? So we don't want to build on something that we know isn't necessarily going to be here. And then I think after that, I'm saying, can we categorize or compartmentalize, let's say, the types of decision we're making? So, for example, when it came to DOSBlog, again, DOSBlog is a blogging engine I work on. And so what we said about DOSBlog is that there's some things that are very specific, declarative statements about the tool in terms of how it was going to interact with a blog post. And it would create a file about it. That was a really big decision back in 2003, right? Now, so how we pick that up, how we create that file, how we pick that file up, none of that stuff changed. What we decided to change was everything above the layers of interacting with the file. So how you interact with configuration files, how you interact with each blog post, how you interact with the files that you save on disk. None of that changed. And we said if we could create an architecture that allowed us to change as little of that, a little of the underlying mechanisms of how it worked, and then on top of that, how our UI worked, then it didn't matter what UI we picked today, because ultimately we separated all the concerns, which is actually one of the fundamental flaws of web forms, right? That it kind of mixes concerns. It mixes the expression of the UI with the business logic that feeds the UI. And so there was actually quite a lot of work of which parts to push down, which parts to keep up in the UI. And so actually, I think, frankly, the decision to separate those concerns was a bigger architectural decision that allows us to, in the future, pivot on whatever decision we made today. So we started thinking about what decision should we make, not just to kind of divorce ourselves of a particular thing, but then to your point, to make sure that it would allow us to make bigger and better decisions going forward.
Thanks. I'm curious about, with that being an open source project that's been around for quite a while, if someone were listening, were thinking that they're going to work on a new open source, say blog engine, do you think they need to be making those sorts of long-term decisions for their kind of initial version of something? Or are these the types of things that you would recommend put that off till later when that's actually an issue you need to deal with?
Yeah, I think, yes, that's a really good question. So I think you should think about it if that's something you have the ability to do, but it's so difficult to really, honestly, it's really difficult to sometimes figure out those long-term questions at the start. And my priority is usually, let's get something out there that people will at least tell you that they're interested in or not, right? Rather than devote massive amount of time to something to keep a promise that no one's listening to, right? So I like to make sure that this is something people like, or I mean, depending on the time you're using, you may be just using this time because you want to stretch these muscles, and that might be an opportunity for you to do that. In which case, go for it. But I like the idea of let's create something that's usable, and let's iterate on that usability, rather than invest a bunch of time up front. And that's only because I I like to value my time. So I want to make sure I'm creating something that is helpful, and then I start to think about what it looks like to keep this going 5 years from now and 10 years from now.
Thanks. Do you use the metaphor technical debt at all in your day-to-day work?
I do think about that a lot. And I'm more likely, it's funny because I think with the project I'm working on in my spare time, the way I think about technical debt there is a little bit different to the way I think about it at work. At work, I'm much more stricter about creating debt for myself and for the teammates. Whereas when I think about what I'm doing for DOSBlog, I'm more likely to take out loans against my future self, right? I'm more inclined to say, I will take care of this later. I will incur this debt and pay it back a little bit later.
For those listening, you work on the Microsoft VS Code project, right?
Visual Studio, yeah. So specifically not VS Code, but yeah.
Okay. Out of curiosity, for those maybe listening, what exactly does a program manager do on a project like that? What are you responsible for?
Yeah, so a lot of what I do is essentially Microsoft's DevDiv division. We're basically the tools division, and we take care of all the kind of public-facing tools you'll use, and that include, as you mentioned, VS Code, Visual Studio, and a bunch of tools in that space. And what we think about, we kind of split our division into two. We've got an engineering set of engineers and program managers, and I'm a program manager. And what I think about as a program manager is representing the community inside engineering meetings. So I'm an engineer myself. I've been engineering for 20 years, producing software for financial services and a bunch of other places for years. But I joined as a program manager because one of the things I think that software fails is sometimes, and I always like to use the analogy of promises, but we make the wrong type of promises with our software because we didn't ask the right kind of questions. And so as a program manager, I think my job is to find enough vocal people or non-vocal people, frankly, and find out exactly how they plan to use the software, how they currently think about the software. And when we're making decisions, engineering decisions, I represent their ideas exactly in the room. I'm not thinking about it. I don't have a alignment to a particular technology. I have an alignment to a customer need and a customer desire. And I want to make sure I'm representing that whenever engineers are sitting down and trying to make a decision about what to do next. So for me, it's really about representing the customers to our ideas.
Thanks for the distinction there between the Visual Studio and the Code app, for example. How closely do those teams work together in terms of their products?
So yeah, we do. I think we are ultimately trying to make sure that we're actually going after two slightly different markets, but certainly we learn from each other in terms of ideas and concepts. At the heart of it, they both have really kind of different debugging engines. Certainly, I would say VS Code is much more lightweight editor and has probably a much more straightforward debugger. Visual Studio being a bigger product, a much longer lived product, much more complicated debugger. It's able to do probably a little bit more when it comes to diagnostics and debugging. So kind of tools on two different spectrums, really. I think you would start, in a spectrum of things, I would say there's Notepad. There is some editor that's giving you kind of plugins and giving you a bit more feature sets. And then you have on the far end, you have the kind of like a more enterprisey type Visual Studio where folks are kind of producing software at scale. Probably, I think that's the kind of rough way I kind of like to think about it. So there's this kind of crossover in everything, right? There's something I'm going to probably need from a simple Notepad editor. That's very, very useful. I don't mean to malign Notepad. And then VS Code kind of sits in the middle and it kind of is lightweight. You can open it in a second. You can start your editing of, your JavaScript files or what have you. But then if you've got these massive projects with lots of different concerns and intersecting dependencies, now that's probably more like you're going to probably need, or you should be thinking about at least how Visual Studio could help.
We'll be back with our interview with Mark in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I want to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to Maintainable. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Also, do you know someone in the industry that I should be speaking with on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm. And now, back to our interview with Mark Downie. Is it safe to assume that Visual Studio has its own fair share of technical debt? I know you kind of touched on that it's a big project and it's been around for a long time. I mean, I remember using it a long time ago. I'm sure it's had definitely some iterations since I last touched it in like 2002.
So I can't speak to the debt. I can speak to the size, right? So the one thing that shocked me, I've been at Microsoft now for coming around to 2 years this November. And the thing that really surprised me was how massive the code base is, so you've got these teams of between 2 to 12 engineers, each with a particular specialty, all kind of interacting with Visual Studio, all needing to communicate with each other to make sure we are kind of pushing forward at the right cadence and doing the right things, and an improvement I make actually benefits somebody else in their space. So what shocked me was the complexity of such a large piece of software, and how it's almost like you've got 20 small startups talking to each other constantly and moving a product forward. So yeah, I can't speak to the debt. I think I would need somebody a bit more into the code side to speak to that. But the size I can absolutely speak to. I know that when I make for example, if I speak to somebody in the Roslyn team who's fundamentally concerned with .NET and the changes they make will have kind of a downstream impact on me, and I need to make sure that I'm constantly talking to those folks. So just in terms of size and what I know about debt, I can only assume that there is some in there at least.
How does a team, when you have all these different teams working together, do you have much exposure to catalogs that type of work, those maintenance, technical debt type issues within their teams? How do they, have a good sense of how they prioritize that?
Yeah. So I think what usually happens with Visual Studio is we release, if I kind of speak through how we kind of release a particular feature. So with my group, we have several previews that kind of help us introduce a new idea and a new concept to everybody. So we actually have a site, this developer site, that we get in ideas from the community, or they'll send us and tell us there's bugs on. So we have a developer community site. They'll tell us there's an issue, or they tell us there's a new feature. So then when we go to execute on that particular feature or bug, we are presenting that first to the community and to everybody via the previews. So when we're presenting these kind of options and these features through the preview, we're not necessarily as strict about what that how that fits in with the grander picture and how that will look like in its final iteration. So there may be a little bit of debt there, right? But what we get with the preview is an opportunity to talk to the customers via the actual product itself. And then we get to see, well, did this actually solve the problem? And the reason why we kind of are willing to kind of deal with a bit of debt there, because we may actually, even though I'm here as a program manager, we still may get that answer completely wrong, right? I'll interview a dozen engineers and they'll tell me one thing only to realize that they were kind of some edge case that really wasn't representative of anything, right? So what we do is we say in this preview, we're willing to take on a little bit of debt. We may even take on a little bit more than we should. Now, I'd say not more than we should, more than we normally would if we knew this was a solid idea. And we'll say, does this work in the way you think it works? And they'll tell us yes or no. And if it works, then by the time we get to the release, or we'll make a plan for another release, to make sure that we've shored up everything associated with that. Again, that just allows us to not spend as much time on a problem that we're not sure if it's solving correctly, or we'll make sure that we kind of just take a loan, like I say, against the future.
So being able to do that, kind of get a concept out there, get some feedback, and then you can do your refactoring and like, okay, we're on the right path. Maybe there's a few tweaks we need to make, or as you said, maybe you're completely wrong. Let's yank it, right? And like, let's start again, or that we're not going to go forward on this idea. That's some good advice there. Out of curiosity, when you're thinking about, managing and like when it comes to like your open source project that you DOSBlog, for example, how are you going about managing technical debt in that type of project? Is that something that the public open source community people can go look at here's the backlog of things, or the things that usually just floating around in the developers' heads, occasionally gets put into an issue somewhere in a tracker? Or
so I'm out on GitHub. I am constantly creating issues. I realize I'm constantly creating debt even when I don't mean to. It's like having a credit card and not realizing, like I have a debit card and a credit card in my wallet, and I sometimes pull from the wrong one, and I do that all the time when it comes to coding, right? So I'll make a decision only to realize a few months later that actually that's, the long-term implications of that particular decision are going to be with me for a long time, and I need to figure out how to get rid of it. So I constantly put things in my issue backlog, and I actually more recently I've been more deliberate about marking them for the community to take care of if they want to, and kind of trying to communicate not just to a future version of myself, but to everybody in the community. Hey, this is an issue. If you want to take it on, you can, and this is the reason why I had it. And I'll try to mark those up and give people a chance to kind of either comment on it or decide if they want to take it on themselves. It's been interesting because with a product like DOSBlog, which has been around for a long time, people will recognize, especially people who've worked on this project a long time ago. I've kind of taken on the mantle of this much more recently. So within the last 4 or 5 years, the project had essentially kind of reached completion, and folks had kind of gone their separate ways, and it was kind of left alone. And I decided, actually, I like this project. I use it, but I want to see it keep going. So on taking it on, I guess now at this point, I still get feedback from those original members who were using the product or contributing to the product. And they still have very much strong opinions about what it might look like or what it should look like. And so I find that interesting as well, because not only do I have a debt to the actual product and putting into it, but I think I have a debt to the people who originally worked on, to make sure that I don't go too far away from the ideas and the features that they're used to. So a lot of people who used the old DOSBlog are now using the kind of new DOSBlog. So I think about debt not only to the product as I'm creating it, but debt to the original concepts of the product, and how I can either fulfill those debts or literally abandon them if that's a good idea.
It's interesting the way of thinking about it. And you were saying promises, and like the software made some promises at one point, and are those going to be deviating? And I have a couple of open source projects myself, and I'm not actively as involved in them now as I was 5 to 10 years ago. And so we have other people working on them primarily. And so there'll be conversations about making some bigger changes, like, whoa, wait a minute. Like that kind of deviates from like my vision for the project, but I also trying to weigh up that balance. I'm like, but I'm not the one day to day dealing with the project. So it's like, it's an interest. So being on the other side of that, being the person that's like maybe the original developer on something, I can see how that could be a little bit of a fun dance, I suppose, to try to cater to the users, the original creators, and the future direction of the project, trying to find some healthy balance in there. You can't make everybody happy, I suppose. I know that I was looking through your own blog, and I know you mentioned like there's some articles in there, and one of them was about, you mentioned labeling GitHub issues with certain types of labels for like, say, newcomers, good for first pull requests, I think might be one. Do you participate in things like Hacktoberfest at all on that type of project, or?
I haven't to this point, but one of the things I want to make sure I'm focused on is making open source a bit more approachable and friendly, especially in the .NET community. I think I'm always kind of critical of whatever community I am, to make sure that we are as open and as welcoming as we can be. that we are supportive as we can be to new developers, to folks from maybe differing backgrounds. And so I've been really trying to make sure that I am labeling and letting people know, hey, if you want to come in here, knock around for a little bit, make a mistake, feel free to do whatever you want, and get my opinion. I'll get some feedback on your .NET contributions. Feel free. It's perfectly safe to do so here. I created a couple of blog posts just to kind of let people know that, hey, this is a good environment to get some feedback, to kick around the tires on an open source project. A judgment-free zone. I'll just try to help you make the change. And I think that on-ramp to our community is going to be critical, frankly, for its future. I would like, more folks who have kind of gained success to make opportunities for success for others. So what I think about now is, before I used to fix the tiny bugs myself at speed. I used to just go through, and I've kind of grown comfortable with them existing and with them being there to make room for other people, because I think that's frankly more important, to make a community that you want to exist in yourself. So I've been really thinking about that an awful lot recently, and trying to make sure that I'm making that on-ramp, because I think there's tons of people who would enjoy this community, who would love the tools we've got in this community, and would be really successful in this community, but may have been turned off by barriers that were frankly unnecessary to put up in the first place. So I have been trying to be much more cognitive, or much more cognizant, of that barrier.
Hi there. Do you know someone who might be looking for assistance with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon would love to meet them. We're offering a $1,000 referral bonus. Send someone our way, and if they sign up for services with Planet Argon, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And in return, you'll get a check for $1,000 in the mail, just for knowing the right person. Hop on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more information and to refer someone our way. That's planetargon.com/referrals. Thanks.
There's almost like two user groups for like open source projects, I think. There's the people that are going to use the project and maybe install it and use it day to day, spin up a blog and with that software or whatever the project is. And then there's the people that might contribute to the project. They're probably using it, but the ones that actually like, okay, I'm actually going to dig into the code. I want to make some tweaks to this, or I want to propose something, or I want to help fix a bug or improve the documentation. And so for like my open source project, one of my projects, I've always had a very focus on like, I want this to be really tailored to making it really easy to install and useful for people that are kind of new to the industry. But contributing to the code is like, well, maybe there's more complexity in there in some ways, but how can we make that easy to as well? And so it's interesting to hear you talk a little bit about how trying to make sure you're making it accessible to a variety of people and different backgrounds and such. And it might be their first time, and there's like, we have interns coming in and out of my company, on a regular basis. And it's one thing I'm always encouraging, like, definitely try to find a way. Like, you don't have to contribute to open source. There's not, like, that shouldn't be the reason why someone hires or doesn't hire you or even consider like that. It's a voluntary thing you're doing with some of your time. Maybe your company can pay for you to do some of that, at work or whatever. But I don't feel like getting the grid of your GitHub profile is like any way, shape, or form shouldn't be the goal. It's also not a bad thing if that is your goal and you want to do that, but it's just more of a don't set that expectation there. I think it's just more of the open source community, I think, has had a lot of pride in the fact that they've been able to do a lot of these things over the years without necessarily a lot of support from the bigger companies like Microsoft. The perception of that back in the day, because I know that Microsoft in the early era of the, there's definitely, it's been an interesting thing watching that transition happen over the last couple decades. And it's like the fact that we're talking about open source projects and Microsoft, now, like it's, like I was going to say, like with like VS or with the code project in particular, one thing we run I work in the Ruby on Rails community as far as frameworks go, and my company runs a survey every 2 years or so, and code is now the most popular editor in the Ruby on Rails community. And like a third of all the people, over 2,000 people responded, said they're using code now. And I was like, wow, I'm like, that's so impressive, considering that it's not necessarily historically been a Microsoft environment necessarily.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it speaks to, I think, how having a certain type of openness is attractive to folks. And surprise, surprise, right? That so like I said, my tenure with Microsoft started about 2 years ago. So the perceptions that were out there, I absolutely shared, right? But then something happened a few years back where they started by just simply coding in public and not really accepting pull requests. And then they started accepting pull requests and really became not just source open, but open source, right? They really became a company that was kind of developing ideas and really pulling into the community, which is actually one of the reasons why I joined, is because I saw how that customer focus just was actually made business sense to them, but actually became a part of the ethos of how we're going to be customer centric. Look for opinions of the community. What are they saying? How are they using our product? Does this make sense? And so that I think that attitude has kind of been beneficial, because the attitude toward Microsoft as being this massive hostile company has kind of changed, really. And it's not easy to change that kind of perception. And to see them do it is something I'm definitely very proud of.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm always kind of curious. I don't want to dig too far down this path necessarily, but I think there's almost like another way of thinking about it, how it's changed. It's like there's almost been like a generational change, because we're talking about a couple of decades too. So it's I don't know what the world was like in the 80s and 90s as a software developer necessarily. So, but Microsoft's always been around, and so it's been good to see how they've been able to become good contributors and members and participants in the open source community. So I'm curious if as you're touching on some ways to make things more accessible. Could you, for those listening that might have an open source project with some level of usage of their from by other people and some contributors, but they're not feeling like they're really getting many contributions from new people necessarily that they didn't already know, what advice could you offer them on how to start reaching out and to foster that sort of community?
Okay, so I think one of the things I think I would promote is make sure that you've labeled all your issues appropriately. I would be deliberate about creating issues. I'd be deliberate about labeling them, and I'd be deliberate about communicating, hey, this is for the community. This is, in fact, if I've got people here who would normally pick up issues, I don't want you to take this issue. I literally labeled a few of mine and said in the messages, actually, this is for folks who are new. So don't do this if you are. I literally don't want you to take this. You're a regular contributor. I know you're brilliant, and I know you could do this in 5 minutes, just as this evening. But I actually don't want you to do. I want this to be an issue that somebody who's new can take on. And my plan is to keep them around for a few weeks, see if somebody wants them, and then after that they may expire. But then create another set for folks who may want to come in and contribute in some small way to build their own confidence. You mentioned interns earlier, and I think one of the things that's really powerful about intern programs is that it's a confidence builder to show people that they actually belong. It's really not about getting cheap labor. I hope that's not what it's about, but it's about showing people that they belong by actually sitting them in the job, right? And so that's what my hope is, that we can show people you actually belong in this community. You have a place here. So, just being mindful is the only thing I think that stops some people from joining communities that you create.
And I want to re-stress that point about how important it is to just make sure that people, especially interns, we're wrapping. We have tomorrow. It's like a Thursday right now. We have tomorrow's a Friday when we're recording this, and we have a couple of interns that are wrapping up. And the big thing for them has been, I do belong in this. This is something I can do. They're very intimidated when they start. I don't know how your experience with interns have gone, but we've tried to be very intentional about the fact that we're going to put you on projects that already exist, because that's rarely does someone ever join a project and get to be there day one and be part of the framework decision making, start writing a new code. And a lot of software development boot camps and, programs are a lot of focus on learning the fundamentals and the basic, building new things usually, not usually digging into something that's been around for 10 years and being like, okay, what's going on here, and trying to piece together this bigger thing. But within, weeks, couple months, they start gaining confidence, and that's important for them, I think. And so yeah, definitely make sure. I'm also curious if you have any things you've learned with, like, experimented with recruiting people into the project. For example, one of the things that I do on my project is I'm always trying to tout the number of contributors that we have. I'm like thinking this is a subtle way to remind people, like, we've had over 1,400 people contribute code to this project that's in the in the main branch. Like, that's awesome. This wasn't Robby's project. This was like a community project, and so I'm always wondering if that has helped me gain more traction with the number of contributors that we've had, but I don't know that for a fact. It's just curious if you found some interesting ways to try to pull that to build the community.
Actually, I haven't done anything like that. I just make sure I'm constantly talking and tweeting about my work and getting people to come either via my blog. I kind of talk about it on my blog quite a bit, and just advertising there's lots of different communities. For example, on Twitter, Code Newbies, there's a couple of other kind of communities where you can say, hey, this is a friendly spot for you to come. So just kind of finding those communities where folks who are, maybe fresh out of a boot camp and are looking for something to kind of to sink their teeth into. Like I said, I think the responsibility is ours, right? Those folks who are kind of established, to make sure that our community continues to exist by presenting opportunities to folks that as they come into and get close to our community. So, yeah.
So a couple of quick last questions for you. Another maybe advice thing from you. Let's assume there's a few people listening who have a large laundry list of technical debt maintenance type tasks with their open source project. And perhaps it's a little overwhelming. What advice could you offer them on how to just start prioritizing what their team or themselves should be working on kind of next?
Right. I think for me, so I guess it depends on the condition you find yourself in, but make those decisions early that if your product's already out there and you've got some maintenance issues, I think make sure you're kind of dealing with the issues that are going to have a long tail, that are going to impact. So I know it's kind of tempting to kind of fix the veneer, to fix the surface, because that kind of makes things look good. But if you have a problem that is essentially or a solution that will impact the product over the long haul, kind of get that into the works as quickly as possible. Because ultimately, one of the other things that comes with maintaining a product is the idea of it splintering and necessarily people having different desires of it. So if you've got something big, I'd kind of like to kind of front load that, because that decision will lead to other decisions that you will inevitably have to kind of build on. So I like the idea of front loading my big decisions and making sure that those kind of get the biggest priority with me, and actually talk to people, blog about the decisions you're making and why. What I found is that people love to talk about software decisions, and given a good environment and a safe environment to talk about it, people will give you really constructive feedback. They'll tell you why one decision may be more important than another. Listening to the community, listening to the users is obviously just the very best. You think you have the best thoughts because you are writing the code, and that's rarely the case. Your community always has the best kind of angle on your product.
That's some excellent advice for folks listening that have open source projects in particular. So what non-software development related book do you find yourself most often recommending to people in our industry?
So it's software adjacent, I'll say. I've talked a lot about customers and their opinions, but this customer-driven playbook by Travis Loudermilk and Jessica Rich, it's heavily influenced towards the software industry, but it's really not so much about software itself. It's about listening to customers. It's about converting the feedback we receive from customers into successful features and successful products. It's about the cadence you need to set up to make sure that you're listening to your customers in the right way, that you're asking the right kinds of questions, to make sure that you are producing the actual product that they need rather than the product that you're excited about. And I think that's always again, as the person who's doing most of the work on DOSBlog, I know what I want, but I'm also really interested to find out exactly what was there before and what folks in the future might need. So, and that needs me sometimes to just ask other people questions. So what this kind of book sets out the kind of framework, literally a framework for asking questions, a framework for talking to customers, a framework for gathering feedback, a framework for executing on that feedback, for prioritizing that feedback. So I love that book in as much that it really made, in terms of program management, I think if you were thinking about being a program manager and thinking about applying to Microsoft, if I can tell you, that's a great book to come armed with, to have read and to have kind of looked at and invested in. That's certainly, in fact, the authors actually work at Microsoft, and kind of they developed the kind of system internally to us, and it's actually just a great read in and of itself.
Excellent. We'll definitely include links to that in the show notes for everybody. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts on software development online?
So I blog at poppastring.com, poppastring.com, and I tweet a lot. It's technical and non-technical, so decide for yourself if you want to follow me there. But my blog is mostly technical, I talk about the products I'm creating. I talk about what I'm creating at work, what I'm creating with the blogging engine DOSblog. So yeah, feel free.
Well, excellent. It's been such a delight having you on Maintainable, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us.
This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Maintainable.